One.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to virtually join you this afternoon in Montreal and to bring you up to date on the work of the Education Fund over the past couple of years. As many of you are aware, the Education Fund was set up as a charitable foundation in 2001 to work with the National Council of Women of Canada in providing research and public education on the social, mental, physical, and health needs of women, children, families, and communities, along with other environmental concerns. Our board is comprised of women representing the grassroots membership of the councils and federates from all across Canada, Rani Gupta and Sheila Pepper from British Columbia, Brenda Beluziak from Manitoba, Gracia James from Ontario, Carol Schweitzer from Quebec, Karen Dempsey from Nova Scotia, and I am from Saskatchewan. Our members are very community-oriented and as such bring a broad, inclusive perspective to our planning and programming. Since our inception, the EF has ensured there is a concerted effort to underscore and amplify the concerns and issues identified in the common program that is adopted by the NCWC membership every 2 years. Therefore, these past 2 years have dealt with the myriad of issues that encompass the theme of housing is a human right. Our first presentation, titled Ending Homelessness 101, How We Get There, featured Kaite Burkholder Harris, the Executive Director of the Alliance to End Homelessness in Ottawa. She had been previously engaged as a policy analyst with the Reaching Home, Canada's homelessness partnering strategy, as a system planner with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and as a project manager for A Way Home, Ottawa. She candidly shared her firsthand knowledge of the challenges and successes in preventing and ending youth homelessness and encouraged us to adopt those best practices in each of our communities. Kirsten Bernas, our second presenter, is a coordinator with the National Social Housing and Human Rights Campaign, Director of Policy Advocacy at West Central Women's Resource Centre in Winnipeg, and chair of the provincial working group, Manitoba's Right to Housing Coalition. Through her engaging webinar entitled Social Housing and Human Rights, Mobilizing for Change, Kirsten challenged us to press politicians to learn from past mistakes and poor results, and to instead focus on the necessity to embrace a comprehensive approach that tackles the housing crisis on multiple fronts. Our third webinar featured guest speaker Ricardo Tranjan, a political economist and senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. He had previously managed Toronto's poverty reduction strategy and taught at universities in Ontario and Quebec. His presentation, titled The Tenant Class, clarified the multifaceted issues facing our underhoused and unhoused population. He identified the issues of structural inequality, economic exploitation, and the rise in the number of financialized landlords in Canada as being of particular concern. He recorded a YouTube presentation titled What Happened to Rent Unraveled, and I think you'll find it quite edifying.
The average rent for a 2-bedroom was up 2% in 2020, up 3% in 2021, up 5.6% in 2023, and then up 8% in 2024. That's a whopping 16% increase in 4 years for a rental unit of that size across the country. Not to mention that in 2024, there was an average 23.5% increase in rent when units changed from one tenant to another. How did we get here? Let's unravel what happened to rent. In Canada, about a third of people rent the place they live, a number that's on the rise. That means being part of what's known as the private rental market.
The private rental market have the basic function of being profitable. And for any business to be profitable, there are two things to do. You reduce costs you increase prices, so your profit margin it's higher. Any private landlord will try to run a profitable operation, so they'll try to increase rents. And there may or may not be regulations on how much they increase rents by.
Historically in Canada, the rental market was seen as like one step on what they call the property ladder. As a young person, you would rent until you could afford to buy a home. That was always the role that policymakers saw rental housing providing. Increasingly, of course, as homes have gotten out of reach for so many people, renting is not one step on the property ladder. It is the final destination for a lot of people. What that has meant is people who otherwise have very high incomes, and maybe even 10, 15 years ago, they would have been able to afford a home. Now they are renting.
And those higher income earners who are now renting instead of buying can often afford to spend more on a unit, pushing up the price for everyone else.
That is going to naturally push people into smaller units than they would otherwise like to occupy, right? And of course, some people get pushed out of rental housing altogether.
In the current market, that increase in demand is combined with a lack of supply. Only 2% of rental units are vacant across the country. And when supply doesn't meet demand, there is significant pressure for rental prices to rise. The high cost of everything, including housing, causes a spike in inflation. The Bank of Canada increases interest rates to slow down inflation. That works to slow down a lot of spending on consumer goods. But housing is different because everyone needs a place to live. And that 2% vacancy rate doesn't leave a lot of options for renters. At the same time, those increased interest rates also result in higher mortgage rates, including for landlords who then raise rental prices to make up the difference. It's a real catch-22.
There will always be a struggle between tenants who want to pay less and landlords who want to extract more income from them. So that's the nature of a private rental market. And that has not fundamentally changed throughout Canadian history, throughout, anywhere where you see a private rental market.
That explains how some of the recent rise in rental prices is about market forces. But market forces aren't the only cause, and not all the causes are recent. Some of what's happening now actually started 3 decades ago, in the 1990s, when the real estate market went through a fundamental shift that is still resonating today.
What has changed in the last 30 years, give or take, is that we've seen the arrival of new types of landlords, new investor landlords, large and small, that come to the whole real estate industry with a different mindset.
That different mindset is part of a phenomenon known as the financialization of housing. The financialization of housing is when housing is treated as a way to generate income for shareholders, rather than a human right or a social good. It opened the door for smaller investors to buy into the real estate market, including residential rental properties, through the creation of something called a real estate investment trust, or REIT. To understand how it works, let's take a step back 30 years to unravel why the financialization of housing happened. In the mid-90s, the Canadian government changed tax laws to allow for new and different tax breaks to real estate funds. This made it more attractive to invest in the real estate market, as the income from these REITs was being passed directly to investors with a lower tax rate than other forms of real estate investments. And it allowed for smaller shareholders to access real estate without having to tie up a large amount of money. It was also the same decade where the federal government withdrew from funding any social housing at all, which meant no more federal funding for building affordable housing. It became the responsibility of the provinces. At the same time, laws were changed to loosen rent control and make it easier to evict existing tenants and charge higher rents to new tenants. All 3 of these factors, changed tax laws, withdrawal of funding for social housing, and less rent control, made investing in rental properties more attractive. And it paved the way for the first rental housing real estate investment trusts, or REITs, to be created in Ontario in the 90s.
These are some of the culprits when we talk about the financialization of housing. REITs own these apartment buildings and they operate them as income generators for, in some cases, like pension funds.
What this has done is make housing more like commodities, just a thing that can be bought or sold, like gold or stocks, rather than something that people need to survive every day. That disconnect is exacerbated when housing is treated like any other investment. Rental housing as an asset is everywhere in the current investment market. The Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan is invested in housing, the Federal Public Servants' Pension Plan, popular mutual funds are invested in residential REITs, and all of these places need to make money for their investors, many of who are average, everyday Canadians. And especially with REITs, the only way they can do this is by raising rents or charging fees to tenants.
Any private landlord will try to run a profitable operation. And there's two ways of doing this: reduce costs or increase rents. So they'll try to increase rents.
You see, REITs exist to pass a profit from the property directly to shareholders. And the REIT has to share the bulk of that profit with their investors in order to maintain their specific tax status. Because REITs themselves don't get taxed on that profit as long as they pass it to their shareholders. And the shareholders pay the taxes on it, but only if they don't hold those shares in a tax-free account like a TFSA or an RRSP.
They are calculating whether their investment in real estate is more profitable than alternative investments, because that's how they're thinking. They have money, they have to invest on something, and that something has to be more profitable than the alternative. So they come into the market with really high expectations of high returns on investment and in a fairly short amount of time, because they have to report back to the investors and say, this was a good investment, give us more money, we're gonna do it again. So what that in practice has created is a kind of like a predatory landlordism that is even more aggressive than the traditional type of landlordism. And among other things, we see higher and quicker price increases, we see more pressures on evictions and other such things.
And in the US, large REITs and property management companies associated with them are at the center of a Department of Justice antitrust lawsuit that alleges these companies colluded to set artificially higher prices for rent across the country. A lawsuit that has some in Canada proposing a class action against companies here as well. So, to sum it up, REITs and private equity have changed the nature of the rental market, making it more aggressive and less friendly for renters, while allowing investors to take advantage of tax breaks. But not all landlords get those breaks.
Then at the other end of the market, a huge amount of our rental supply is basically mom and pop landlords, if you want to think of it that way. Maybe they own a unit in a condo. Maybe it's a basement of their home. Maybe they own one or two rental homes, but just a huge amount of the rental market is actually held by a very large number of very small holders. So it's a very different dynamic depending on what kind of landlord you're talking about.
Mom and pop landlords don't have the same tax breaks as the big REITs do, nor do they have the same resources when it comes to dealing with problem tenants, or spreading losses over multiple properties, or even taking advantage of different regional markets. And while mom and pop landlords still have the largest portion of the overall rental market, big REITs now own an estimated 20 to 30% of all of the purpose-built multifamily rental housing across the country. And they're growing. REITs are starting to get into the development side of things. They're building new rentals that add to the supply of units available, but would also be subject to the same business practices of current REIT-owned buildings. And the pressure of REIT-owned rental units is significant. So, where does all of this leave us?
I think we cannot square that circle on having housing being very profitable and very affordable. We just can't. We have to choose one or the other. So if we choose affordability, the long-term solution is to increase the share of all rental units that are not for profit. Right now in Canada is only about 4% of all housing and about 12% of all rental housing that is not for profit. We need to increase that and increase by a lot. We need to double that and then double again and double again until non-market housing is a very significant share of all housing.
You will have noted from this presentation that financialized landlords' main objective is to apply strategies that increase profits, not for anyone else, but just from distribution to their executives and investors. In doing so, they've also contributed to rising inflation rates, the loss of affordable housing stock, higher rent, housing instability, and reducing the ability of tenants to contest rate increases. Soon after that, we hosted a panel discussion with the theme, New Solutions to Old Problems. One size does not fit all. One of our panelists was Chief Brendan Mitchell, Regional Chief for Newfoundland with the Assembly of First Nations, who is responsible for their housing, homelessness, and infrastructure portfolio, along with the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure. We were made painfully aware that First Nations people are disproportionately impacted by homelessness and housing insecurity, which is coupled with the underfunding of services for Indigenous individuals and families. He invited us to champion access to safe, secure, adequate, and affordable housing for all First Nations people, no matter where they live. Chief Mitchell was joined by Tim Richter, President and CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. His leadership helped shape federal, provincial, and local homeless action and policies, including the national implementation of Housing First, the National Housing Strategy, and Reaching Home, Canada's homelessness strategy. Tim shared his work as co-chair of the National Housing Council in providing demonstrably usable advice on improving the national housing strategy and advancing the progressive realization of the right to housing. The panel was rounded out with community activist Donna Brooks, CEO of the Prince Albert YWCA. Donna oversees a continuum of support services for vulnerable people in the city of Prince Albert, which is a service center for all of northern Saskatchewan. Donna's leadership has resulted in shelters, programming, and support for women, women with children, youth with cognitive disabilities who are aging out of government care, parents who have lost their children to the care of the government, those suffering with addictions, and newcomers to the city and/or Canada. Her comments, based on her boots-on-the-ground work, showcased a positive way for other communities to understand and embrace the humanity of homelessness. Our moderator, Stephanie Langenegger, host of the CBC Saskatchewan Morning Edition, led us through an intense examination of the societal ills that have resulted in this human crisis, right through to both proven ideas and novel concepts designed to meet the multifaceted challenges of homelessness. The discussion was enriched by the perceptions, observations, and dedicated work of our panelists, who defined not just the causes of, but the solutions to these complex societal issues. Each of these presentations on our common program was a weaving of the soulful tapestry of humanity, woven in part by the threads of addiction, violence, mental illness, abuse, poverty, neglect, and even a sense of hopelessness. And each of our presenters reminded us of the human face of homelessness and the urgency with which we must now act. It is now our challenge, indeed it's our responsibility, to follow their leadership and weave in the strong threads of support so this tapestry becomes a living testament to the respect, dignity, and care that we as humans provide one to another in the darkest of times. And now it is our pleasure to invite you to join us for our final presentation on housing as a human right, as we will welcome Madame Marie-Josée Houle, the Federal Housing Advocate. We will gather on Wednesday, June 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time via Zoom. Madame Houle's presentation will focus on a recent review panel known as NEHA that examined the right to safe, adequate, and affordable housing for women, Two-Spirit, trans, and gender diverse people, and the government's duty to ensure its availability. NEHA is a Mohawk word meaning our ways, and it describes a way of life that is open, peaceful, supportive, and healing. Seen as an ever-expanding circle, NEHA is a space where individuals with lived experience, or organizations representing them, can share their expertise and work together towards solutions. All evidence and testimony gathered from this review will shape the final recommendations to be sent to the federal government, to which they must respond within 120 days. This approach of Madame Houle's reminds me of an African proverb related by a British feminist author, Dr. Jessica Taylor, who wrote, "Until the lion learns how to write, the story will always glorify the hunter." As we understand this truth, we can more fully appreciate that so many of our social narratives are controlled by our hunters. As she reiterated in her book, Why Women Are Blamed for Everything, we will, and indeed we must, do better to empower our women, Two-Spirit, trans, and gender diverse people to share their stories of trauma, of abuse, pain, and turmoil, along with their hopes, dreams, and ideas. Madam Houle has also indicated that she will be pleased to address your written questions as well. So please send them to me prior to June 11th or write them in the chat box during the event. And special thank you to Penny for placing the link to register on our NCWC website under events. In closing this report from the Education Fund, I wish to sincerely thank Stephanie for her technological expertise that has enabled me to join you in this virtual capacity. I also thank the boards of the NCWC and the EF for their assistance in promoting and facilitating our events over the last 2 years. But we sincerely and deeply thank and appreciate each of you for sharing your time and your thoughts with us as we worked together to ensure our common program of housing is a human right echoed right across our country. Your generous financial donations assist us in achieving our mandate by enabling us to engage knowledgeable, credible presenters on our topics. And for that, we are very grateful. Our secretary, Carol Schweitzer, will be honored to accept your donations today and forward them to our treasurer, Karen Dempsey, who will ensure you receive a tax receipt in a timely fashion. And of course, you may donate online anytime at Canada Helps. As it's not possible for me to respond to your comments and questions today, it's very fortunate we have two of our board members, Carol and Brenda, attending the AGM and conference in person, and they would be pleased to answer any of your questions. Or you can certainly email me at any time with your suggestions, comments, or concerns. And it's been wonderful to share this time with you today. Like-minded women who are dedicated to working together to improve the quality of life for women, children, families, and indeed the whole of society. So thank you. And until we meet again, be kind to yourselves as you take care of each other.